1943. Allied pilots were dying by the thousands, picked off by Luftwaffe fighters who owned the sky from above. Then a handful of mavericks tried something so reckless it seemed like suicide. They dropped to treetop level, turned the earth itself into a weapon, and suddenly the hunters became the hunted. But how did flying at 50 feet, where one mistake meant instant death, become the tactic that broke the Luftwaffe's back? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the winter of 1942, the sky over Europe belonged to Germany. Every morning, young men from Britain and America climbed into their bombers knowing they might not come home. The numbers told a terrible story. Out of every 10 crews that flew over occupied France or Germany, 3 would never return. Some died in explosions so fast they never knew what hit them. Others fell slowly, spiraling down in burning metal coffins while enemy fighters circled like sharks. The ones who survived their first 5 missions were considered lucky. The ones who made it to 10 were considered miraculous. Nobody talked about what happened after 20. The German Luftwaffe had built its entire war machine around one simple idea: height equals power. Their Messerschmitt fighters could climb faster than almost anything the Allies had. Their pilots trained for years to master the art of the high-altitude attack. They would spot Allied bomber formations from miles away, climb above them where the air was thin and cold, then dive down with the sun behind them. By the time the bomber gunners saw them coming, it was already too late. The Messerschmitts would slash through the formation, guns blazing, then climb back up to safety before the escorts could react. It was mathematics, it was physics, it was doctrine, and it was killing Allied airmen by the hundreds every week. The bomber crews felt it was the worst. Inside a B-17 Flying Fortress at 25,000 feet, the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Ice formed on the windows. Oxygen masks froze to faces. The men sat in their positions for 8 or 9 hours, knowing that enemy fighters could appear at any second. They watched their friends die in the plane next to them. They saw aircraft explode into clouds of aluminum and fire. They counted the parachutes and knew that most times there were not enough. When they finally landed back in England, their hands shook so badly they could not light their own cigarettes. The fighter pilots who escorted them felt helpless too. The early Spitfires and P-47 Thunderbolts were good planes, but they had limits. They couldn't stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back. They ran out of fuel. So there were long stretches where the bombers flew alone. And that was when the Luftwaffe struck hardest. The escort pilots did what they could. They climbed high. They maintained formation. They followed the rules they had learned in training. But the rules were written by men who had never faced the Luftwaffe at full strength. And the Luftwaffe owned the high ground. In squadron ready rooms across England, young pilots studied maps and listened to briefings and tried not to think about the odds. They were 19, 20, 22 years old. Most had never been in a real fight before the war. Now they flew into battles where dozens of aircraft tangled together in a space smaller than a football field, all of them moving at 300 miles per hour, all of them trying to kill each other. The old veterans, the ones who had survived the Battle of Britain, told them the key was altitude. Get above the enemy. Keep your energy up. Never let yourself get slow and low. Down low, you were dead. Down low, you had nowhere to go. Down low was where the ground killed you, even if the enemy did not. But scattered across the Allied air forces were a few pilots who had started to notice something strange. During reconnaissance missions, flying low to photograph German positions, they found that enemy fighters sometimes lost them. A Spitfire pilot named Davies had been jumped by 2 Messerschmitts over northern France. He dove hard, expecting to die. But instead of climbing back up, he stayed low, skimming over farmland at 300 feet. The Messerschmitts followed, but they seemed awkward down there. They overshot him twice. Finally, one of them pulled up and left. Davies made it home and filed a report, but nobody paid much attention. It was just one incident. It was probably luck. Then it happened again. An American P-47 pilot named Kowalski got separated from his formation during a bomber escort mission. 3 Focke-Wulf 190s came after him. He was out of options, so he went down. Not just down to 5,000 feet, down to 500, then 200. He flew so low over a German airfield that he could see soldiers diving for cover. The Focke-Wulfs tried to follow, but they were too fast, too heavy. One of them hit a radio tower and exploded. The other two broke off. Kowalski limped home with bullet holes in his wings, but he was alive. When he told his story at debriefing, the intelligence officer wrote it all down. But still, nobody changed the training manuals. The doctrine remained the same. Height equals safety. Height equals power. Never go low. In the spring of 1943, the air war was getting worse. The Germans had moved more fighters west. They had better tactics. They had veteran pilots who knew every trick. Allied losses were climbing toward numbers that could not be sustained. Some missions lost half their aircraft. Command was getting desperate. They needed something new. They needed an answer. But the answer, when it finally came, would not come from headquarters, or from tactical schools, or from men with rows of medals on their chests. It would come from a handful of young pilots who were tired of dying according to the rules. Pilots who were willing to try something that every instructor had told them was suicide. Pilots who looked at the ground rushing past at 300 miles per hour and thought maybe, just maybe, down there was where the Luftwaffe could not follow. Maybe down there, in the grass and the trees and the valleys where radar could not see and doctrine did not matter, was where the war could be won. But first, they would have to survive long enough to prove it. The first pilots who went low and lived to tell about it started sharing their stories in bars and mess halls. Word spread quietly at first, like a secret that nobody wanted to say out loud because it sounded too crazy to be true. A flight leader named Morrison tried it with his entire squadron during a sweep over Belgium in May 1943. They had been sent to hunt for German transport trucks. Instead of staying at 5,000 feet where the book said they should be, Morrison took them down to 100 feet. They followed a river valley, their propellers so close to the water that they kicked up spray. When they came around a bend, they found exactly what they were looking for. A German convoy, 40 trucks stretched along a country road, completely unprepared. The first the Germans knew about the attack was when cannon shells started ripping through metal and wood. Morrison's squadron made 3 passes. They destroyed 27 trucks, a fuel tanker, and 2 staff cars. Not a single Allied plane was hit. The German soldiers barely had time to jump into ditches. Their anti-aircraft guns never even fired. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the Spitfires were already gone, disappearing back down the valley at 300 miles per hour. Morrison filed his report, and this time people listened. More squadrons started experimenting. They discovered that everything they had been taught about low-altitude flying was backwards. Yes, it was dangerous. Yes, one mistake would kill you instantly. But it was not suicide. It was something else entirely. It was a different kind of war. The German radar stations that could track a bomber formation at 20,000 feet could not see anything below 500 feet. The radar waves bounced off hills and trees and buildings, creating so much confusion that the operators just gave up. A fighter at treetop level was invisible until it was right on top of you. And by then, it was too late to do anything about it. The tactic spread like fire through dry grass. A group of American P-47 pilots started what they called milk runs. They would escort bombers to the target, then on the way home, they would drop down and hunt. Airfields were the best targets. German fighters had to land eventually, and when they did, they were sitting ducks. The P-47s would come in so low that the Germans thought they were their own planes at first. One pilot named Jackson described flying between 2 hangars with his wingtips just feet from the walls on either side. Another pilot, Martinez, said he flew so low over a German mess hall that he could see officers diving under tables through the windows. In one attack on a training field in northern France, 6 P-47s destroyed 43 German aircraft in less than 4 minutes. Most of the planes never even got their engines started. The Germans tried to adapt. They put up more anti-aircraft guns around their airfields. They stationed fighters on constant alert at low altitude. But it did not work. The problem was that the Luftwaffe's best fighters, the ones that had ruled the sky for 3 years, were terribly down low. A Messerschmitt 109 at 20,000 feet was a beautiful killing machine. At 100 feet, it was clumsy and dangerous to its own pilot. The plane was too fast. It couldn't turn tight enough. The heavy engine made it nose-heavy, so pulling up required both hands on the stick. German pilots who had shot down dozens of enemies at altitude found themselves helpless down in the weeds. They had trained their entire careers to fight one way, and now the rules had changed. Some of them tried to learn the new way. Most of them died trying. Meanwhile, Allied pilots were getting better at it every day. They learned to use terrain like a shield. Valleys and forests became highways where radar could not follow them. They learned to read the landscape at 300 miles per hour, spotting ditches and power lines and church steeples in time to dodge them. They learned that the human eye could not track a fast-moving target against a cluttered background. A German soldier looking up might see a flash of metal, hear the roar of an engine, but by the time his brain processed what he was seeing, the plane was already a mile away. It was like trying to swat a fly in a dark room. British Typhoon squadrons perfected something they called cab rank tactics. They would circle over the battlefield at ultra-low altitude, waiting for ground controllers to call in targets. When a German tank column appeared, the Typhoons would drop down even lower and attack with rockets and cannons. The German tankers called them the Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, and they feared them more than anything else on the battlefield. A Typhoon appearing out of nowhere, firing rockets from 200 yards away, could destroy a tank before the crew even saw it coming. The psychological effect was worse than the physical damage. German soldiers started to feel like they were being hunted by ghosts. The shift was happening not just in tactics, but in the minds of the pilots themselves. The old thinking, the high-altitude doctrine that said safety came from climbing, was dying. A new kind of pilot was emerging. They were younger, less formal, more willing to break rules. They flew by instinct instead of by the book. A squadron commander named Jameson put it simply in a letter home. He wrote that the Luftwaffe had spent years building a castle in the sky, and the Allies had just stopped trying to attack the castle. Instead, they burned the ground beneath it. The Germans kept looking up, waiting for the next high-altitude battle. But the real war had moved down to the grass and the mud and the treetops, where their beautiful theories meant nothing, and their years of training became a liability instead of an advantage. The Luftwaffe still had good pilots and good planes, but they were fighting yesterday's war, and every day they lost more men who never understood what hit them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was bleeding to death at ground level. The German High Command issued desperate orders to all fighter units. Do not pursue enemy aircraft below 1,000 meters. Do not engage in low-altitude combat. Climb immediately when attacked. But the orders came too late and meant too little. The Allied pilots had already taken ownership of the space between the Earth and the clouds, and they were not giving it back. Every day brought new losses. Experienced German aces, men with 50 or 60 kills, were being shot down by American pilots on their third mission. The mathematics of air combat had been completely rewritten, and the Luftwaffe could not solve the new equation. Hans Müller had been flying fighters since 1940. He had fought over France, over Britain, over Russia. He had 37 confirmed victories. Other pilots looked up to him. Ground crews asked for his autograph. But on a clear morning in June 1944, 2 weeks after the Normandy invasion, Müller learned that all his experience meant nothing anymore. He was leading a flight of 4 Focke-Wulf 190s on patrol over the Bocage country when he spotted 2 American P-51 Mustangs below him. It should have been easy. He had the altitude advantage, he had the sun behind him. He had done this 100 times before. He rolled into a dive and his wingmen followed. The Mustangs saw them coming and did exactly what Müller expected them to do. They dove away, but they did not level off at 5,000 feet. They kept going. 3,000 feet, 1,000 feet, 500 feet. Müller followed, his speed building past 400 miles per hour. Then the Mustangs went lower still, dropping to barely 50 feet above the patchwork of hedgerows and farm fields. Müller should have pulled up right then. Every bit of training he had ever received told him to climb back to altitude and wait for another chance. But he was angry. He was tired of seeing his friends die. He was tired of losing. So he followed them down into their world, and the moment he did, he knew he had made a terrible mistake. At 50 feet, everything happened too fast. The hedgerows were a blur beneath him. A stone wall appeared in front of him, and he yanked the stick back, feeling the extra weight of the Focke-Wulf's heavy nose. The Mustangs turned hard left, and he tried to follow, but his fighter was going too fast. He skidded wide, overshooting them completely. They turned again, and now they were behind him. He could see them in his mirror. He tried another turn, but the hedge lines were coming up too quickly. He pulled harder on the stick, feeling the plane shudder as it tried to respond. For a moment, he thought he might make it. Then his left wing clipped the top of a poplar tree. The impact was not much, just a touch, but at 400 miles per hour, a touch was enough. The wing crumpled, and the plane rolled left. Mueller had maybe 2 seconds to understand what was about to happen. Then the Focke-Wulf hit the ground and cartwheeled across a wheat field, shedding pieces with each impact. The noise was incredible, metal screaming. The engine was tearing loose, his head slamming against the canopy frame despite the straps holding him in. Then silence. He was lying on his side in what was left of the cockpit. His left leg felt wrong. When he looked down, he could see bone. German soldiers pulled him out and got a medic. Through the haze of shock and pain, Mueller looked up and saw contrails high above. Other fighters were up there, doing things the old way. But down here, in the grass, the war had changed into something he no longer understood. In the field hospital 3 days later, his leg in a cast and his flying days over, Mueller talked with another pilot who had survived a similar encounter. The man was younger, maybe 23, and he kept saying the same thing over and over. "We were not ready for this. We learned to fight like knights in tournaments," he said. "They learned to fight like wolves in forests. All our training was about honor and altitude and perfect tactics. Their training was about coming home alive." The difference seemed small, but it was everything. The Luftwaffe had built a philosophy around air combat. The Allies had built a survival strategy. And when those two approaches met at treetop level, philosophy lost every time. An American colonel named Zemke, who had flown both high-altitude escorts and low-level attacks, tried to explain it to a reporter. At 30,000 feet, he said, air combat is like chess. You calculate angles and energy states, you plan 3 moves ahead. At 30 feet, it is like a knife fight in a dark alley. You do not think, you react. The moment you hesitate, the moment you try to remember what the manual says, you are already dead. The Germans were still trying to play chess, while the Allies had switched to knife fighting. German pilots could not make that shift. Their training was too rigid. Their doctrine was too perfect. They had spent years learning to do one thing extremely well, and now that one thing was getting them killed. An American colonel named Zemke, who had flown both high-altitude escorts and low-level attacks, tried to explain it to a reporter. At 30,000 feet, he said, air combat is like chess. You calculate angles and energy states, you plan 3 moves ahead. At 30 feet, it is like a knife fight in a dark alley. You do not think, you react. The moment you hesitate, the moment you try to remember what the manual says, you are already dead. The Germans were still trying to play chess, while the Allies had switched to knife fighting. German pilots could not make that shift. Their training was too rigid. Their doctrine was too perfect. They had spent years learning to do one thing extremely well, and now that one thing was getting them killed. A French pilot flying for the British named Klosterman wrote in his diary about what it felt like down low. He said flying at 50 feet was like riding a motorcycle at 400 miles per hour through a forest in fog. Every second you were one mistake away from death. A bird strike could kill you. A moment of distraction could kill you. Your own prop wash bouncing off the ground could flip you over. But if you could handle the fear, if you could turn off the part of your brain that wanted to climb to safety, you became nearly impossible to stop. You appeared from nowhere, you hit hard, you vanished before anyone could respond. The ground was your ally, the trees were your cover, the hills were your shields. Everything that made high-altitude combat predictable made low-altitude combat chaos. And in chaos, the rigid fighter loses to the adaptive one every single time. Hans Mueller returned to Hamburg in the winter of 1946. The train ride from the hospital took 2 days because so many bridges were gone. When he finally arrived, limping on a cane because his left leg had healed crooked, he barely recognized his own city. Entire neighborhoods had been turned into fields of broken brick. The famous church spires were stumps. Children played in bomb craters. His apartment building was still standing, but 3 of its 4 walls were missing, leaving rooms exposed like a dollhouse. His wife and daughter had moved in with relatives in the countryside. He had no job. The Luftwaffe no longer existed. For 3 years, he had been one of Germany's hunting eagles, feared across Europe. Now he was just another broken veteran in a broken country, trying to figure out how to survive peace. In the summer of 1947, Mueller attended a denazification hearing. All former military officers had to go through them. It was mostly paperwork and questions about what he had done during the war. He told the truth. He had been a fighter pilot. He had shot down Allied planes. He had followed orders. The British officer conducting the interview asked him detailed questions about tactics and training. After the formal part was over, the officer, whose name was Davies, invited Mueller to have tea. They sat in a dusty office, and Davies explained that he had also been a fighter pilot. He had flown Spitfires. For an hour, two former enemies talked about the war in the sky. Davies described how the low-altitude tactics had developed, how pilots had figured it out through trial and error, and how the doctrine had spread from squadron to squadron. Mueller listened carefully. Finally, he spoke. "We flew like gods," he said quietly. "You flew like men who wanted to live." Davies nodded and poured more tea. What haunted Mueller was not that Germany had lost. He had known for years that defeat was coming. What haunted him was how completely the Luftwaffe had been outthought. The Allies had not beaten them with better planes or braver pilots. They had beaten them by changing the rules of the game entirely. The Luftwaffe had clung to its beautiful theories about energy fighting and altitude advantage, even as those theories were killing everyone who believed them. Mueller remembered the orders that had come down in 1944. Do not engage below 1,000 meters. But by then, the entire war had moved below 1,000 meters, and refusing to fight there just meant dying without fighting back. The Allies had taken the one place where German doctrine did not work, and they had made it the main battlefield. It was brilliant, it was simple, and the Luftwaffe had never seen it coming. The pilots who pioneered treetop flying went on to shape air combat for the next 50 years. The tactics they invented in desperation over France and Belgium became standard training in every air force in the world. When jets replaced propeller planes, pilots still learned to fly nap of the earth, using terrain to hide from radar and missiles. In Korea, American pilots flew close air support missions at 100 feet, attacking North Korean positions with the same techniques that had worked against the Wehrmacht. In Vietnam, pilots hugged valleys and hillsides to avoid surface-to-air missiles. In the Gulf War, Apache helicopters hunted tanks by hiding behind sand dunes. The doctrine of low-altitude attack, born from a handful of maverick pilots in 1942 and 1943, became one of the most important ideas in modern warfare. But the deeper lesson was not about altitude, it was about adaptation. The Luftwaffe had been built by the best military minds in Germany. Its tactics had been tested and refined. Its pilots had trained for years. Its doctrine was based on sound physics and mathematics. And all of that had made it brittle. When the situation changed, when the enemy stopped playing by the expected rules, the Luftwaffe could not bend. It could only break. The Allied air forces, thrown together from a dozen different countries, flying a mix of different planes, led by officers who often argued with each other, had been messy and chaotic, but that chaos had made them flexible. When one approach did not work, they tried another. When high-altitude bombing proved too costly, they invented low-altitude interdiction. They were not smarter than the Germans, they were just more willing to be wrong and try again. An American pilot named Kowalski, one of the first to survive a low-altitude escape from German fighters, gave an interview in 1985 for a military history documentary. He was 70 years old by then, gray-haired and slow-moving, but his eyes were still sharp. The interviewer asked him what it had felt like that first time, diving to 50 feet with enemy fighters behind him. Kowalski thought for a long moment. "I was terrified," he finally said. "I was 22 years old, flying 50 feet off the ground at 350 miles per hour, and I thought I was going to die. But I did not die, and the guy chasing me did. That was when I realized that fear is just an altitude you have not lost yet. Everything they taught us said that safety meant climbing higher. But sometimes safety means going lower than anyone thinks is possible. Sometimes you survive by doing the thing that everybody says will kill you." The war in the air was not won by the side with the best technology or the bravest men. It was won by the side that could unlearn what it knew when what it knew stopped working. The Luftwaffe flew for glory and honor and perfect execution of doctrine. The Allies flew to win and go home. At 20,000 feet, those two approaches looked similar. But at treetop level, where mistakes were instant and fatal, where doctrine meant nothing and instinct meant everything, the difference became clear. Glory could not save you when your plane was too heavy to turn. Honor could not help you when the ground was rushing up at 400 miles per hour. Down in the grass and the trees, only one thing mattered: being willing to change. Being willing to survive ugly instead of dying beautiful. And that willingness, more than any weapon or tactic, was what won the war. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.